All right, let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. Second Samuel chapter 6. We're going to go ahead and read through the chapter here. It says, Again David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baale of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth between the cherubims. And they set the ark of God upon a new cart, and they brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps, on psalteries, on timbrels, on cornets, on cymbals. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and there he died by the ark of God. And David was displeased because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah unto this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and said, How shall the ark of the Lord come to me? And so David would not remove the ark of the Lord unto him into the city of David, but David carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord continued in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And it was told King David, saying, The Lord hath blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that pertaineth unto him because of the ark of God. And so David went and brought up the ark of God out of the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And it was so that when they that bear the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with the linen ephod. And so David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as soon as David had made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he dealt among the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to everyone a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh, a flagon of wine. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. And then David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, How glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of the servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. And David said unto Michal, It was before the Lord which chose me before thy father, and before all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord. And I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in mine own sight. And of the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them shall I be had in honor. And it says, Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child unto the day of her death. And so this story takes us back to kind of the beginning of 1 Samuel. And I'm sure you probably remember, but in 1 Samuel, the Israelites were doing battle with the Philistines, and it wasn't going well. And so they decided what would aid them in the battle was to go get the ark and to bring it before them. And we talked about this then, but they kind of viewed the ark not necessarily as a means to receive the grace of God, but they kind of saw it as almost like a religious relic, that if we have this, it'll bring us luck. It'll bring us good fortune. And if we have this on our side, we can't lose, kind of a thing. Well, they did. And the Philistines stole the ark. They took it to Philistine land. There was a lot of miraculous events that took place with the Philistines and that were negative. And obviously they didn't want the ark anymore. And so they send it back to Israel. And so for 20 years then, the ark had been sitting in the house of Abinadab, mentioned there at the beginning, in the house of Abinadab in the city of Kirjath-Jearim. Now here the city is called Baalah of Judah, but it's the same city. And so it's been sitting there for 20 years. So now David decides it's time. He's firmly established himself in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been firmly established as the capital of Israel. And so now he wants to bring the ark and place it in Jerusalem. And what that does is kind of twofold. It solidifies the city of Jerusalem, but furthermore than that, not only does it solidify it as the political capital, but it also solidifies it as, we might call it, the spiritual capital, or the place where we read several times in the book of Deuteronomy, the place where God would choose to place his name. Okay, I gave you one of the references there, but it says that many, many times in the book of Deuteronomy. And so God told him, there will be a city, there will be a place, I will choose to place my name there. And David is staking the claim that that place is Jerusalem. And so by bringing the ark there and setting it up in the tabernacle, David is saying that this is what that's going to be. Jerusalem is that place. And so he gathers this procession, and it was quite impressive. It says there that David gathered 30,000 chosen men. Now, usually when the Bible uses that, or in reference to David, his chosen men, it has a military connotation. But that's not the case here, because David's not going to battle. He doesn't need protection. The ark isn't in a foreign land. There's not hostile territory to go through. They're going to the house of an Israelite who has been watching the ark for this purpose. And so now it's just the time to go get it. And so he doesn't call these 30,000 men for the purposes of an army and for the means of protection, but he calls these 30,000 men to go with them because he wants worshipers to praise God. That's why he calls them. And so I really want to emphasize, because there's a very stark event, obviously, that happens here with Uzzah, and I want you to get how stark it was, okay? So you have David, and you have his 30,000 men, and you can just imagine this procession. Obviously, 30,000 is huge, right? This is a large procession of people, and all of these people, they're dancing. We can imagine singing. We know that they're playing instruments. There's all this noise going, but it's all done in praise and worship of God. They're doing things out of their heart, I think we can imagine. They take the ark. They bring this brand new cart. Now, we're not told anything about the cart other than it's new, but it's probably this beautiful cart. And they put the ark on that cart, and they're all following this. The sons of Abinadab are following, are leading this procession near this cart. And again, they're singing, they're worshiping, they're praising, they're dancing, they're playing music, they're doing all this. And then all of a sudden, everything stops. Right? And so you can just imagine this cacophony of sound and praise and worship going on, people dancing, all these things, and then all of a sudden, the ark starts to shake a little bit. Uzzah just instinctively, I'm sure, instinctively puts his hand up just to steady it. And then all of a sudden, now he's dead on the ground by the ark. And so you can just imagine, all right, if you've ever been to 4th of July parade or Christmas parade or something, and all these people, and, usually there's bands playing music, there's all this kind of stuff going on. You can imagine how things would shut down rather quickly if somebody just dropped dead on the spot. Right? And so this is kind of what's happening here. And so because of this, because of how shocking, and it's supposed to be, because of how shocking of a moment this is, a lot of people object to this, and that includes David. And we see it here that David objects to this. However, we have to understand what's happening here, and we need to put it in its proper context. God had given them very clear and strict instructions about how the ark was to be moved, at which they failed every single one in this procession of people. And so most of this is taken from Numbers chapter 4. Some of it is not, but mostly from Numbers chapter 4. We know that when the ark was being moved, it was to be covered. And not only just covered, they were to cover it with the veil that separated the holies from the Holy of Holies. And so they were to take that veil, and with that veil, the priests were to take that veil and to cover the ark. And then only once that ark was covered with the veil, then those from the family of Kohath would come in, they would take the ark, and the ark was built so that it would have staves that ran through the bottom of it, these long poles, and those men from the family of Kohath would take the ark with those poles, carry it upon their shoulders from place to place. That is the way that God very clearly laid out for the ark to be moved. And beyond that, it's not to be touched, right? The ark is not to be touched. The priest would cover it with the veil. The Kohathites would not touch it at all. They didn't do any of that. They didn't do any, not one part of that was done in this particular procession. And so we can see again that they didn't follow a single instruction of God, which is why God killed Uzzah in this particular moment. And now David said, that the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah. In fact, he names the place Perez Uzzah, Perez meaning breach. So breach of Uzzah. And so David is not happy about this. And David's reaction to this is the same of a lot of people who would read this story, which is, how could God do such a thing? And furthermore, why would God do such a thing in the midst of a group of people worshiping him? And we can assume that Uzzah was a part of that. I see no reason from the text here to think that Uzzah was removed from the worship. I think he was probably dancing, maybe playing an instrument himself. Whatever the case was, I think Uzzah was very much a part of the worship that was going on. And still, even in spite of all the worship, all the praise, everything that was happening for God, God still takes the life of Uzzah. There's a very important lesson for us to learn here. And I want you to see kind of a similarity here, because I thought this was interesting. God had done a similar thing in the previous chapter, in chapter 5. So in chapter 5, 2 times David was fighting against the Philistines. One time God tells him, go fight, I'll give you the victory. And that happens the second time. God says, don't meet them face to face. Go around behind them, and then I will come and I will destroy them, or I'll help you, right? And then after that happens, David says in the last chapter, the Lord hath broken forth upon mine enemies before me as the breach of waters. And so he uses the same language to describe what God did to the Philistines, to describe what God just here did to Uzzah. I'll quote J.P. Folkman. He said, once again, the deity has broken loose with the numinous power and unexpectedness which petrifies a mortal. And this time not in favor of David's undertaking, but to its detriment. Here's the lesson we learn from this. God's holiness will not be mocked, whether by Israelite or by Philistine. It doesn't matter if it's by his people or by his enemies. God's holiness will not be mocked. All of God's law was put forth to be an expression of God's holiness. And God said, here's the law concerning the movement of the ark. Here's what you do. You cover it. You carry it with the poles. It's done by the family of Kohath. You don't touch it. None of that happened. Not one single level of that happened. And so it doesn't matter how well-intentioned this whole procession may have been. It doesn't matter that they were singing. It doesn't matter that they were playing instruments. It doesn't matter that it doesn't matter all of the worship they're doing, because they were not obeying God. Okay, so David had to learn the same lesson as Saul. Now get this. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, this is when God told Saul to go wipe out, if I'm not mistaken, the Amalekites. I think that's accurate. God says, go wipe them out. Don't save anything. He doesn't do it. Right? He keeps part of the people. He keeps part of the animals. He comes back, and Samuel confronts him, and he says, hold on, you didn't do what God said, right? And Saul tried to get out of it, but Samuel had to tell Saul this. He says, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? He says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. In other words, what does Samuel tell Saul here? God prefers your obedience over an improper worship, even if that worship is done with the best of intentions. Now think about this. I want you to kind of get this in your mind. I've tried to kind of establish a word picture here. So imagine the procession that David orchestrated. Again, I think he did it from the best places in his heart. I think he really thought that this was the right way to do this. This is going to honor God. This is going to glorify him. And so he brings out 30,000 people worshiping, dancing, playing music, all this. Makes a brand new cart for the purposes of putting the ark on, right? He thinks, I'm going to give God the best. Right? I'm going to make this brand new ark where it's going to be pulled by oxen. Everything is going to be done with as much intentionality as possible. And so you have all this going on. And then on the other side, imagine in your mind just 2 Kohathites carrying the ark on their shoulders. Now, if I was to ask the average person which one of those scenes more glorifies God, probably most people are going to pick David's. Most people are going to look over that and say, look at what they did. Look at how much effort they put into it. Look, they brought all these musical instruments, and they're playing, and they're dancing, and they're singing praises, and they're doing all this wonderful thing. Surely that glorifies God more than just 2 guys carrying the ark on their shoulders. But God will always choose the other, because that's what he actually prescribed. That was what was in obedience to the Word of God. And this has a lot of, you've probably already beat me there, but this has a lot of modern implications. People today are, you heard of these seeker-sensitive services. People today pump a lot of money, time, and effort into producing a beautiful product with regards to the worship to God. There's a lot of churches today that you walk into their sanctuaries, and every single inch of that sanctuary was thought out beforehand of exactly what was going to look, how it was going to function, what role it was going to play within the worship services. Every second of that worship service is planned down to the minutest detail. All the screens, all the music, all the instruments, everything is just planned out. And I would say with some of it, I wouldn't say all of it, but with some of it, again, just like David, I think done with the best of intentions. Right? We're going to draw people with the quality that we are producing. And at the end of the day, what they have neglected is just, what does God tell us to do? And God is not impressed with your money, time, and effort spent if you are not also trying to say, we're going to be as obedient to the Scripture as possible. Because the Scripture does tell us what we are to be doing as a New Testament church. And so there are things that we must be doing to actually be in obedience. And if all we're doing is focusing on producing quality experiences, which I think David was doing here, maybe we're missing the point. Maybe we just need to get a couple of Kohathites and put the ark on their shoulders. And so David, he missed the point. It's almost, again, I don't want to give the impression that David did this out of a bad heart. I think he did it with good intentions. But it's almost as David thought, what can I do to most impress God? And that's what we'll do. And also don't miss his earnestness. I mean, David did think he was doing the right thing, and in that, he did it with all his heart. I mean, we'll get here in just a second, but later on, Michal looks out the window. She sees David. What is he doing? He's dancing with all his might. He's giving God everything he can in this instance. It's just not what God told him to give, right? And so that's the issue in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now, this unsurprisingly results in a healthy fear of the Lord. You see David's response to this. After it talks about his displeasure, in verse 9 it says, "And David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how shall the ark of the Lord come to me?" He should have been afraid of the Lord that day. He absolutely should have been. Every child of God who comes into a heart of worship ought to do so with a fear of the Lord whom they are worshiping. Ought to do so with the fear of the Lord that absolutely could strike down the Uzzahs of the world at any moment. And so we've got to understand who it is we worship. Obviously, Hebrews says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, right? And that's absolutely true. And so this is, I believe, a very, very important story with really, really strong implications for our modern church. Now, ultimately, they decide to wait. And I would like to know how this man was chosen. I mean, imagine being Obed-Edom. I don't know if he was a part of this procession. I don't know if he just happened to have a house near where this took place, and they thought, hey, let's just take it to the nearest house. I don't know how this man was chosen. But imagine being Obed-Edom and being, hey, Uzzah just died because he touched this thing, and we're putting it in your house. But nevertheless, here's Obed-Edom. The ark comes to him. But we see at the end of verse 11, the ark was in his house for 3 months, and it says, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now, it's important for us to understand that, because what we see is that Uzzah died not because there was some kind of curse upon the ark. It had nothing to do with what the ark was. No, the ark goes in his house, and it blesses him. The ark was in Abinadab's house for 20 years, and it blessed them. Right? So it didn't have anything to do with the ark. It had everything to do with their lack of proper worship. Okay, and so David eventually hears about this. It says, verse 12, and it was told the king that, hey, Obed-Edom and them, they're getting blessed. So, if you thought there was something wrong with the ark, that's not what's happening. And so David decides then, yes, now's the time. Now, he doesn't, and I this is probably clear, but it's not as if David hears Obed-Edom's getting blessed, and David thinks, I don't want Obed-Edom getting blessed. I want to be blessed, so you go get the ark. That's not the case. David understands now that there's nothing wrong with the ark, right? The ark is still the object of God's presence. And in fact, it says in verse 2, that they go to get the ark of God. At the end of verse 2, it says, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth between the cherubims. Right, we referred to that as the mercy seat, and it was seen as the place of God's presence. And so David now understands that's still the case. The ark is still everything it was supposed to be. There's not some kind of curse upon it or anything like that. And so he decides, right, we need to do what we intentionally, or what we decided to do originally. We just need to do it the right way. We need to do it the right way. And so they do it. It says, so David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. Now look, it doesn't tell us, it doesn't say black and white. So they went and got men from Kohath, and they made sure that the men from Kohath put it on their shoulders, and they carried it with the staves. They did so properly. They didn't. It doesn't say all that, but that is what is implied, especially in verse 13. It says, and it was so that when they that bear the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces. What does that mean? It's not talking about a cart anymore. Cart doesn't go paces. No, when they that bear the ark, what is the safe assumption? That they figured out we need to get the Kohathites. The Kohathites need to come carry this thing on their shoulders, and they're walking with the cart as properly prescribed by the law of God. And so they figured it out. They figured out the problem wasn't our worship, the problem wasn't playing music. The problem wasn't worshiping God. The problem was that we did it devoid of obedience. Because you notice they do the same thing, right? They're still playing instruments. David, and they're still dancing. They're still worshiping going on. But now that worship includes following the means that God had established. And so the way that they worshiped wasn't wrong or bad. It was that they didn't follow in obedience what God had told them to do. And so now they use the same means, but now they're doing it in accordance with the law of God. And that's what matters. And so they are carrying it properly. Every 6 paces, they're stopping and they're making sacrifices, which is, that would be a long procession. This would take a long time, but that's okay. The whole point of this is to give praise to God. Again, they could have just sent 2 guys down there with no procession and brought the thing back, and nobody could have been none the wiser. But they wanted to make this thing something that would glorify God. Yeah.
How many lambs
Right.
it was. We're talking about a bloody situation.
Yes.
And I was just blown away because I'd never heard that.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's, and of course all of it was pointed to Christ. That's, and so, yeah, every 6 paces they're stopping. And they bring it all the way to Jerusalem. Again, sacrifices, dancing. In fact, this time it says shouting and the sound of the trumpet. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, David leading the way, dancing with all his might before the Lord. And so they bring the ark to the tabernacle, and so it says that David brings it into the dwelling place. And verse 17, they brought into the ark of the Lord and set it in the place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And so they move the tabernacle and set it up in Jerusalem. And they bring the ark and place it where it should have been. It has been misplaced for now 20 years. This is where the ark should be. And then one thing that's really interesting is it's almost kind of missed in this particular text. It says, in the middle of verse 17, that David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And then he blesses the people. And then in verse 19, he sends them away with food and drink. But David here acts in this one instance as king and priest. Right? this is something, and we'll talk about this more tonight, but this is something that does not happen in Israel. Israel doesn't have king priests. They have kings and they have priests, but they were separate. They were always separate. And so this is a rare instance where Israel had, just in this one moment, because it wasn't a lifetime thing, but just in this one moment, they had a king priest. Well, of course, we understand almost everything David did. Obviously not everything. But almost everything David did was a picture or a symbol or a foreshadowing of what his greater son would come and do perfectly and would fulfill. And so his greater son, Christ, would come and be the great king priest and would fulfill all of that. And so an interesting thing, again, that's almost missed in everything else that's taking place in this chapter. But David here acting as king and priest. Well, the sad thing about this chapter is with everything else that has gone on, right, they had this horrible tragedy with Uzzah, and then it was corrected, and there was proper praise and worship taking place, and it's almost as if we wished it ended after verse 19. Everybody goes home having been blessed, having been part of the proper worship, going home with food and drink in hand. Households are being blessed. David, it says in verse 20 that David returned to bless his own household, right? David is coming home with the right heart, mindset, everything. And so, we almost wish it was done. Unfortunately, it's not. And so the chapter does end on a sour note. And so while Jerusalem is rejoicing, Michal despises, right? And so Michal, we see this picture of her just having utter contempt for David, for her husband. And one thing, and I don't remember if I ever put this in here or not. I don't think I did. One thing that is interesting to note is that I think it's 3 times Michal here is referred to in verse 16. The city of David, it said Michal, Saul's daughter. Right? In verse 20, it says, is it verse 20? Yeah, verse 20 again, the household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul. And then again, verse 23, Michal, the daughter of Saul. It consistently refers to her as Saul's daughter. And I think the reason why it does this, because it doesn't do this every time Michal's mentioned, I think the reason it does this is because it's placing her, it's almost like when you read through the book of Kings and Chronicles, you'll read of a certain king, and it'll say something along the lines of, they followed their father, and they did what was right in the eyes of God, or they followed their father, and they did that was evil in the eyes of God. Well, here, Michal was following her father, and so she despised David, like her father did. And so there's just this interesting going on. Now, we kind of have to, it's a little bit difficult of an interpretation. And so verse 16, she sees David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him. It's not because of David's dancing. That's not why she despised him. We get a little bit more context in verse 20. And so verse 20, it says, Michal comes to meet David, and she says, how glorious was the king of Israel today. She's being sarcastic, right? She doesn't mean that. How glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. And so we understand from earlier in the chapter that David was wearing a linen ephod. So he wasn't, completely uncovered. That's not the issue. She was not saying you were out there dancing and you were, exposing yourself. That's not what she was saying. Essentially, she's making the argument that you were out there in front of people without wearing the appropriate clothes of a king. That's her argument, right? You're only wearing a linen ephod. You're not out there in your royal apparel. Essentially, here's her argument, just if we're going to put it in the modern vernacular here. Why would you go stand before the peasants and act like you're one of them? That's her argument. Why are you acting as if you're not better? Why are you acting as if you're not in the royal palace instead of the slums? David, what you're doing is unbecoming of a king. That's her argument. What you're doing is unbecoming of a king, especially in front of the handmaids, right? I mean, these are the lowest of the lows. Why are you acting as if you're just one of them? And so David responds, and he says, it was before the Lord. I wasn't doing this for them. That's what he says. I'm not out there trying to make an impression with them. I'm out there doing what I was doing because I was worshiping God. And so he says, I was out there for him. And by the way, I was out there for the one who chose me over your father. David makes sure to get his own jab in there. But he says, I was out there doing this for God. I didn't care what they thought of me. I cared what God thought of me. And it was God who chose me. It was God who put me as the ruler over this land. And we talked about this in the last chapter. David was to be the king for the people. He's not to be the king over the people in this sense, but the king for the people. And he says, in doing this, he says, the maidservants, which thou hast spoken of them shall I be had in honor. Right? They will remember this because I'm being the king that they need. Not only in worshiping God and being an example of good worship, but showing them that I'm not lording my position over them. I can be one of them because I was one of them. I mean, I was taken out of the fields. I was a shepherd. I don't come from a royal line. And so David not only understands where they're coming from, but he was one of them until fairly recently being made king. And so now Michal, having been raised in a royal court, doesn't like David acting as if he's not essentially better than everybody else. And so what's happening here is that Michal was more concerned with appearances than she was with the proper praise of God. Instead of being thrilled and joyful and rejoicing that not only is the ark finally back in the tabernacle, the ark is residing in the Holy of Holies where it should have been all this time, that God has now firmly established Jerusalem as the city where he was going to place his name. She should have been rejoicing that proper worship has now been established, and the tragedy of Uzzah have been overcome. All of these things should have brought her to a place of joy and rejoicing, and she should have been loving, respecting, and honoring her husband. And instead of doing all that, now she's accusatory because David's not doing things the way I want him to do it. And so the chapter ends, verse 23, by saying, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child unto the day of her death. Now this is, verse 23 is unclear if Michal had no child because God cursed her, or simply being this put a rift in the relationship, as it likely would, between her and David just now kept himself from her. Obviously, not to get adult here, but David had other wives and concubines, and so he could have just kept himself from Michal. I think that's the more likely option, because typically when barrenness was from God, the Bible lets us know it was from God. It doesn't say that here. Now, it could be. It doesn't really make a difference either way, because either way, it's the same effect. She had no child. And so that was, whether or not this was a physical cursing of the womb by God, or this was a rift placed there and God used that to keep her from having a child. Again, the effect is the same one way or the other. And so I'll finish here with this quote by Blakey. He said, there are doubtless times to be calm and times to be enthusiastic. And I love what he says here. But can it be right to give all our coldness to Christ and all our enthusiasm to the world? And I'll kind of explain what he's talking about there. We live in a time where people are very comfortable, and I'll use sports because this is kind of where it's seen, I think, a lot. People are very comfortable going to a stadium and screaming their head off for 3 hours at a game, and then coming to church and sitting there quiet as a church mouse, refusing to sing, refusing to open their mouth, either because they're ashamed, embarrassed, or they just are too pious to be seen as giving any kind of emotion in the church. And so it's this very interesting thing, again, to go back to his quote, can it be right to give all our coldness to Christ and all our enthusiasm to the world? Now again, as we have seen, and this chapter makes clear, maybe more than any other chapter in Scripture, there's a proper way to do that. And we have to do it in accordance with God's revealed law. But enthusiasm, joy, emotion, all of these things are good and right in their proper place. We don't want emotionless worship. And the problem today is a lot of people are trying to manufacture emotion. We don't want to manufacture emotion, but we don't want worship devoid of emotion. It should lead us to emotion to think of what God has done. It should lead us to emotion to think of Calvary, to think of the cost of our salvation. And if that can't lead us to sing and to worship and to praise and to make a joyful noise in doing so, but then we can go out in the world and scream and holler and do all things for all other kind of worldly enterprises, what does that say about where our priorities are? And so this is, again, there's so much truth to be found in this chapter about this really unique story regarding Uzzah and the implications of God's holiness and the way in which God desires obedience over sacrifice. Not to say that he doesn't desire sacrifice, but he desires obedience over sacrifice. And so this is an important chapter, a very, very good chapter, to be sure. But let's pray.